He's prepared, right? He's prepared. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. I want to start by explaining why I do the research that I do, and actually even why I'm a qualitative researcher. And then that will get into why I do predominantly longitudinal research. So I started as a high school teacher, and one of the years I was a finalist for the State Teacher of the Year, which was very cool. But part of that was I got appointed to / invited to join a state teacher advisory board. And it sounded very exciting, especially those of you who have done K through 12 education, you know there's a lot of laws that act upon you. And so the idea of, oh, I get to have input now. It became very clear very early on that we were there for the purpose of being seen, not heard. So that legislators could say things to the effect of, well, teachers were involved in this decision-making process, or teachers were involved in the discussion. And it was really frustrating, but it also, it was still informative in that I had a preview of what things might be coming down the pipe in terms of my classroom. And so I remember there was a bill that had been proposed, and I can't remember the specifics anymore. It's probably a repressed memory at this point. But it was something related to high school graduation, and it was a really problematic proposal, very out of touch with students' needs. And I remember, you know, we all as teachers had sort of learned to just occupy a corner and just stay out of the way. And this was enough that we all were just very verbal throughout the entire meeting, to the frustration of the legislators. And teachers would, you know, share these range of various experiences and examples of ways that this was a really problematic bill. And I remember a legislator said, I appreciate that all of you shared your stories, but we need data, not anecdotes. And it just really infuriated me. And I remember sitting there and thinking to myself, of course our experiences and our stories are data, but I didn't have the ability to articulate why they were. And so at a point in my career, I decided that clearly I didn't have enough letters after my name for people to pay attention to what I was saying. So I decided I would go back and do a PhD. But I very actively looked for programs that would enable me to be a qualitative researcher, so that I would have the vocabulary and the ability to articulate why experiences and why narratives and stories do in fact matter and are in fact data. And so, as you will see, the majority of my data is narrative-based, and that's very deliberate on my part, because part of what I'm doing is trying to center people's experiences, center people's understandings as the point of the research that I'm doing. So the longitudinal part is sort of accidental, frankly. My first study, I just intended for it to be for the year that my participants were pre-service teachers. And at the end of it, their response was, well, but like, what do we do now? Like, are you not gonna, like, you don't care anymore? And so we went through the renewing and amending the IRB and so on and so forth. And I learned so much from that study, and it becoming multiple years of research, that now I prefer to do longitudinal research. And so my talk, it's the queer and the unexpected. And so I want to start by explaining what I mean when I say queer, because I do realize that it has very different connotations and denotations depending on who you are academically, intellectually, where you are socioculturally, sociopolitically. And so for me, it's the theoretical concept. And so when I say queer, part of what I'm talking about is this notion of unstable, fluid, non-static identities. And one of the things that longitudinal research has done is really accentuated the importance of understanding identities as being very fluid and shifting all the time. Additionally, looking at the performativity of identities, depending especially on space. The majority of my research is, unsurprisingly, involving teachers. And so looking at the ways that sociocultural and political spaces are often huge factors in the ways that they perform as educators and as people. And then also looking at the ways that normalcy becomes defined and enforced, and how that acts upon teachers, their students, and then specifically in relation to my research, the ways that that pertains to genders and sexualities. So when I say queer, I'm meaning these things predominantly. There's other concepts as well, but these are the key components. And then in terms of, oh, it chopped it off. But in terms of like what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to go through 4 different sections. The first, in terms of like what I've learned relative to longitudinal research, is this idea of participants as being fluid and contradictory people, their identities and their understandings of self being fluid and contradictory at times, and that in and of itself being important findings at various moments. And then the ways that I've learned to theorize and to think theoretically differently, and the ways that my participants have educated me theoretically in some respects as well. And then the ethical implications and the ways that member checking has shifted and changed for me. I've always done member checking. But when you do longitudinal research, sometimes that takes on different meanings, and there's different levels of expectations on both sides. And then the ability for me to have a greater appreciation for what they do as participants, because you form relationships with these people, even if it's just within a research setting. You know things about their lives that you're not going to know by virtue of having interacted with them for a semester or even a year. But also learning to be more critical, both them of me and me of them, and that being something that has come more readily across multiple years of interactions and relationships. So this is kind of where I'm going. And so I'm going to start with the idea of them being fluid and contradictory. And so really quickly, I'm pulling data from 3 primary studies. All 3 of these studies have been based, they've been interview and focus group based. There's also been ethnographic classroom observations, and there's also been document-based data. Most of the documents have been things like curriculum, documents, lesson plans, unit plans, curriculum mapping, but there's also been like school policies, district policies, articles and such that have been incorporated as well. But the one that I'm going to pull from the most was a 5-year study. It's concluded now, but it started out being a question of, so Elizabeth Meyer found in her exploration of what it meant to combat homophobia, transphobia, and sexism in schools, that the majority of the teachers who do that work tend to be early career teachers. And that seems counterintuitive to some people, but the way that Meyer explains it actually makes a lot of sense. And it is this, that in effect, schools that have pervasive homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia, sexism, and sexism in general, are spaces where veteran teachers have typically bought into that culture and have stayed because that space mirrors back to them their beliefs and their understandings. And so it's unsurprising that in spaces where those sorts of behaviors are pervasive, veteran teachers don't act against them because in fact that's part of their identities as well. So in spaces where these sorts of actions are pervasive, it tends to be early career teachers who do that work. And so knowing that and moving from her studies, my initial question was, how do early career teachers construct public identities as LGBTQ plus allies? And specifically, how do they do that in culturally and politically conservative spaces? And all of the participants were in the Deep South, were in the Bible Belt. And then the other 2 are ongoing. One is, it's a summer residential program that has a teaching component. And it started out with a question of like, how does faculty living together matter? How does it matter in terms of them being faculty members? How does it matter in terms of these personal relationships becoming professional or vice versa? And then there were other elements of it that became more specific relative to sexualities and gender as the years have moved on. There is a year of this study that is excluded from the data set, and when I get to the ethical implications, I'll explain why that is. But so it's been going on for longer than 3 years, but only 3 years of it are actual usable data. And then the other one is an online social justice book club that was funded through NCTE's Elate/CEE. What happens is teachers from various states meet virtually online, and then I visit their classrooms, I observe them, and often others will like Zoom in to watch them teach as well. And so their teaching becomes a part of the book club as well. And so these are the studies I'm going to be referring to, and I'll try to explain and situate which ones I'm talking about when I get to various sections. But if you have a question or something's not clear, please ask. So the fluidity of identities and understanding. So this one's coming from the novice teacher study that went on for 5 years. And the questions, and so those of you who came to the workshop yesterday, you've seen some of this data already. But when the study first started, one of the questions that I posed to them was like, what is an ally? Like, what does it mean to be an ally? How do you know someone is an ally? And in the first year especially, they were very clear on this very dichotomous notion of like an ally is this thing, and if you are not this thing, then you are not an ally. And so Lulu, and they gave themselves pseudonyms. So, I don't know, Lulu is a Lulu, in fact. But she says, a teacher can't accidentally do ally work. You either are or aren't, and you either do the work or you don't. And she said this during a focus group pretty early on in the study. Later in the study, Andy, who was a young woman who she self-identified as a genderqueer lesbian, and she says, if you're going to call yourself an ally, you got to get off your ass and do stuff. My mentor says she's an ally, but she never does anything, you know? She talks to kids, okay, but she could start a GSA, a Gay Straight Alliance, and stuff, you know? And this was a later focus group, but it mirrored this sort of just general agreed upon sentiment that ally work was both active and visible. And then Kelly, toward the end of the first year, where they were all pre-service teachers, they were student teaching at that point, says, I think you shouldn't call yourself an ally unless you are actively helping kids. Otherwise, you're a hypocrite. She used like a lot, and so I'm sure that ellipses was me chopping out some of those likes. I mean, if you're not, I don't know, like pissing off administrators and teaching queer text, why are you an ally? And so as pre-service teachers, very comfortably situated within a university context, they were very clear on this is what it is, this is what it is not. And so that could arguably have been a finding, like ally work should be visible. And in fact, there's a lot of literature that mirrors that back, that agrees with that. There's a lot of books and handbooks and articles that make this statement that basically if you're not a visible, politically divisive ally, then you're not really doing ally work. And so what they're saying and arguably aligns with a lot of the literature. So the second year, Lillian says during an individual interview, this is her first year as a full-time teacher, she says, I was so damn stupid last year. I mean, I thought, oh yeah, I'll just teach X, Y, Z and then my little gay children will flock to me, like I'm the fairy godmother they waited for. It's not like that. I mean, there are days when I tell my kids, don't use the word fag because blah, blah, blah. I lay it out for them. Language has power, you know? I tell them about ways that I monitor my own language. And you know how much all that matters? Not a goddamn bit. Not one bit. Their eyes glaze over, they say, okay, and then I hear fag or some other variation about a minute later. I just keep thinking, man, I'm doing everything right, but nothing is different. And then Bailey says similarly, I'm in crazy conservative land. Like I have to lie about living with my boyfriend here. They would fire me if I even dropped the acronym LGBTQ in my class. And so as pre-service teachers, they had this very dichotomous, very clear notion of like ally work is this. The second year, they're not protected by the university context anymore. As pre-service teachers, most of you know, student teaching tends to be pass-fail. And they knew they'd already fulfilled the majority of the requirements. They weren't going to be failed for doing this ally work. The university wasn't going to do that. But as first-year teachers, there's a greater degree of personal risk. There's a greater degree of professional risk. And so this ally work becomes much more professionally compromising for them. And so their understanding, it's not so much that they understood ally work differently. They still understood ally work as needing to be active and visible, but they then understood themselves as being unable to do that work. So in year 3, Bailey offered a very different alternative, a very different perspective. She says, when I do bad stuff, I make the most difference. It wasn't until I took down my safe space sticker that I could really help kids. And that's very counter to the literature in general. I realized that sticker was more for my image than for my support for them. That sounds the opposite of what people expect, I know, but it doesn't make it untrue. When that sticker was up, everyone who came to my room was terrified because they worried that people would think, oh, that kid's gay. So a kid came about an essay. Her parents call wanting to know if she's a lesbian. I was like, what? It was a sticker, you see? I can advocate for them, but it has to be in ways I haven't read about, you know? And so this is a pretty dramatic shift from what they've learned about ally work, what is typically available to be read about ally work. And then Lulu sort of seconded this idea in a completely separate individual interview. There are days when I'm gung-ho. I'm like, let's queer a text we're reading. And then there are days when I don't shut down a heteronormative comment from another teacher because I don't want the GSA shut down. People can think what they want, but both are being an ally. And so they start to redefine ally work in ways that are very cognizant of socio-political and cultural spaces. It's not that they don't want to be allies. It's not that they don't think that ally work is important. It's not that they've stopped to try to do that work. But it's like they understand ally work to now be like negotiable and something that potentially what they're doing is exactly what they faulted their mentor teachers in some respects for doing or not doing as pre-service teachers. But part of this is like recognizing, and it's not that this is not true for all research, but for me, it wasn't really clear for me as a researcher until I started doing longitudinal research, that having multiple conversations with them over multiple periods of time about this topic allowed them opportunities to not just shift in terms of their professional perspectives and experiences, but also to have different opportunities to describe and to understand themselves as teachers, as professionals. And so it was really useful for me in looking at the ways that these identities are fluid, and this idea of ally, for any of you who are familiar with the literature, it tends to be very black and white. Like, these are ways that you do ally work, these are ways that you don't do ally work. These are ways that you can pretend to do ally work, but you're really not still an ally, which is very akin to the first year. But by the third year, what they're advocating for in terms of ally work is, in fact, quite contrary to what a lot of the literature would argue for. And this is not necessarily where they stuck, where they landed. It was a 5-year study, and so the ways that they continued to understand themselves really just depended on where they were and what the stakes were and how vulnerable they felt or didn't feel, or how vulnerable they felt like their actions made kids or not. And so it was this constantly fluid sort of interaction and effort. And there were often contradictions between themselves and established research, contradictions just in terms of how they described themselves in one interview versus a later one. But it was important for me to be able to better appreciate the ways that sometimes we will write articles and we'll use an interview as a basis to understand someone, and in fact, like it's often not fair. I've also learned to theorize differently and to understand and apply theoretical frameworks quite differently. I will say, for those of you who are doctoral students, when I was a doctoral student, the phrase theoretical framework terrified me for probably the first 2 to 3 years of my study, and I kept thinking, like, I gotta have that chapter in my dissertation, but I don't even know what it is. And now, because of the work I've had to do longitudinally, not only is theory something that is very useful and meaningful, but it's sometimes kind of exciting. And so that's come as a result of multiple moments of them shifting my understandings and my perspectives. So one of the things that I did not anticipate was in the 5-year study especially, but in all 3 of the studies, racism, and ethnicity became key components of ways that the participants engaged with the topics of genders and sexualities. And that was not something, it wasn't something that I objected to, it was just simply not something that I had explicitly worked to have them discuss or engage with. But it became very important in some of their discussions with one another and their interviews with me. And so when I was going through some of the data, it was impossible to simply apply like a queer theory or even some feminist theories. And so sometimes I would have to bring in co-authors who knew far more than I did about critical race theory, or in this case, women of color feminist theory, to help better explore the ways that race and racism and racial identities matter relative to genders and sexualities. One of the really common criticisms for queer theory especially, but also many feminist theories, is that they're basically white people theories. And so my participants have forced me out of that box and have really forced me to even critique my own sort of go-to theoretical concepts. And so it's been really useful. Propriaspect is because, especially in the 5-year study that I just shared with you, because so much of where they were contextually mattered so much in terms of how they understood and described themselves and others, it wasn't super surprising that sociological theories became necessary, but it wasn't something I really knew a whole lot about. And so I've had to start like educating myself more fully, because sometimes like sociocultural theory, which is often a go-to in educational research, sometimes sociocultural theory just is not, it ain't it. And so I've started to branch out and to look at like ways that people theorize things like context and actions within context relative to sociological or anthropological work as well. I've also started to use pieces of larger theories. I know that one of the book clubs is reading Butler's Gender Trouble, but in a different work, Butler talks about this idea of losing expertise on gender. And that's one of the things that happened in the residential setting. There was a trans colleague, and there were a lot of very #woke faculty members that were a part of this program that realized they actually didn't know a whole lot of anything relative to this trans colleague. They wanted to support her, they wanted to understand her, but they didn't know what to do. And so a big part of what was happening is similar to what Butler describes, where it's like basically what they had to do was lose what they understood to be their expertise and their wokeness, so that they could be better colleagues and better teachers. And then others of these, skipping all down, the last one, Britzman wrote a really great chapter/article on queer pedagogy, and it's often invoked in genders and sexualities education research. But one of my participants, Lulu, in fact, we read that chapter in prior to one of the focus group meetings, and Lulu really gravitated toward this notion of alterity. And in fact, Ryan and I actually presented at LRA, and I talked about the way that Lulu applied alterity to reading within her literacy classroom. And it's basically just like reading for otherness, reading for discomfort. But like Lulu was key to teaching me this new concept. I had read that article multiple times, but I had never gravitated toward or even thought about applying that particular theoretical concept. And it was key to then writing about Lulu and talking to her. And these other ones, the teacher demoralization theory is one like Lillian was just like, you need to read this, because when I read this, I was like, this is me. And so some of these are ones that participants have given to me, and it's like, this is a way to better understand and to theorize where I'm coming from. And it makes the things that I've been able to write about them much more useful. And I think that's one of the effects of longitudinal research in general, is that they become more invested in what's happening, because publications start to roll out and they realize like you're actually writing about them. And so, you know, if you're in like year 3, you're typically publishing on like year 1. But you know, there start to be larger stakes, and they start to take interest in like the ways that you're writing about them and the ways that you're understanding and interpreting them. And so they've educated me as well. And so these have all been, the teacher development, the generative doubt, like those are all ones that they were just like, you need to read this. I think this would be useful. Or you got this wrong. Sometimes they're harsher than reviewers. You got this wrong. You need to read this and you need to redo it. So sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, but you know. And so just really quickly, like this propriaspect was one, I was writing specifically about Lillian. It's upcoming, it'll be in English education in April. But Lillian was very adamant about the ways that her space, her physical space, mattered in terms of who she was able to be relative to being an ally. And I started to realize that, like, generally speaking, that was more of a sociological concept. It was one that that most of the educational theories were not going to be fully, I was going to have to like hybridize multiple theories. And so it's like there's disciplines that already do this work. Like I need to just learn. And so the key components are basically that it doesn't matter how big your context is. Even in a huge context like Auburn, for example, everybody navigates that same large space differently because it's relative to an individual. But at the same time, we also have whatever our individual experiences are constantly tied to larger cultural norms. And so there are things like, to invoke Harvey Garfinkel for some of you, there are things that you would do here, like yell war eagle at people, that in other spaces would either be extremely alarming or be, in my space, offensive. And so this is a way. It was a useful way to theorize this concept of she was constantly acting independently because she was acting against school norms, but those school norms always mattered. They didn't stop mattering. It's not like when she closed her door, they ceased to be present. And so this is an example of her theorizing, because I shared this with her, because it was, I gave her a short article by Adler, and I was like, what do you think? And she's like, oh, this is good. And so she told me this story, and then the next one is her theorizing through Perpetuate. So Lillian says, Mr. Milton, or Coach Milton as the kids call him, some of you know these people, is my next door neighbor in terms of her classroom. Like, his classroom is right next to mine. So basically he knows everything going on in my classroom and vice versa. So one day I'm trying to get my kids to go down the hall to another classroom with a new co-teacher. And the co-teacher comes back and says, the students won't go with me. They won't go into the classroom. So I leave the half of the class that was staying with me to deal with these kids, and I'm like, go to the classroom, go with Miss Usry. And I'm raising my voice because I need for all of them to hear me. And Coach Milton sticks his head out of his door and is like, oh, look at Miss Carol. She's so precious. Look at her trying to be tough. Like, he says that about me where the kids can hear him while I'm trying to get them to do something. So one of the kids who had been doing as I asked chimes in and says, yeah, Miss Carol, you need to be sweet. And then a day later, he's telling everyone else about me yelling at the kids. He uses yelling, and that pisses me off because he really does yell at his kids all the time. But when I raise my voice, suddenly I'm a crazy woman. And so I'm talking to her about this propriospect concept, and she, like, so the next interview, she says, anytime, so she was teaching of mice and men. And so she was talking about that, and this is her response. Anytime that I want them to think about gender as constructed or fluid, they dig their heels in. And it's hard not to blame them, I guess. Yeah, there's the media and everything, but I mean, they see and hear it at school. Coach Miller calling me precious. And then my own principal and other teachers calling me angelic. Those are all moments when the adults reinforce really problematic gender roles. And those messages are far-ranging in terms of the ways that they respond to me and what I'm teaching them. And so, like, the example she gives is they're talking about Curly's wife not having a name, just being referred to as Curly's wife. And the kids then invoke, well, you're married, you know, and you don't, like, we don't even know your first name. And she's like, I don't even have conversations with these kids about the fact that I'm married. But they see the ring. They see the pictures, and they understand from all the various interactions they have in their school what that means here to be a woman, what it means here to be a married woman. And so they apply those concepts they're witnessing outside of this space to even the literature that we're reading. And it becomes really problematic. And so she talked about, like, first of all, it was impossible to get the kids to disengage gender from sexuality because they always understood the two to go together. But then on top of that, to have the kids think about gender or sexuality as non-binary when it was constantly reinforced, like, in the hallways, she's like, it's impossible. And she even talked about, like, her own physical self reinforced binary notions of gender. And she's like, I don't mean to, but just my physical presence, like standing there with long hair and a dress and a wedding ring and a picture of, like, my husband on the desk, she's like, I'm playing a part of that culture too. And so it was useful, first of all, for me to have a new way to think about the way that this context and culture matters, but it was also really useful for her to then have the opportunity to theorize with it as well. For member checking and ethical implications, some of you know, like, member checking, so I will just tell you, sometimes participants, especially early on in a study, you send them a transcript and you're like, you know, I'd like for you to look over this. And 10 minutes later, a 42-page transcript, they're like, yep, looks good. You ain't read that. And so sometimes participants are just sort of like, yep, I trust you, which is terrifying. Or you end up with the other end of the spectrum where it's like, I've changed all these things that I think are problematic, and you're just like, and you didn't even say these things, but I'm glad you felt the need to type them into the transcript. But for longitudinal research, member checking and the ethical implications become actually much more interesting. And so initially, as I said, they would just very cursorily review a transcript and be like, yep, it's great. And then after I started to publish things from the research, and I would share with them the manuscripts I was writing about them, it started to matter to them a lot more about what was being said. Like, the stakes became higher because it's like, well, what if my principal suddenly knows that, like, this is me? And we would work really hard to anonymize it so that that wasn't clear, but it's like, what if your principal does know this is you? And they also became much more adept at the academic jargon, like, for example, applying theories themselves, examining transcription. I showed Jeffersonian transcription to some of the people at the workshop yesterday. Some of my participants became very adept at that because that's the way that I would do some other transcripts. And so they became much more able to just navigate and negotiate this academic ease because it mattered to them. It had implications beyond just I'm chatting with someone in an interview. In terms of the ethical and the legal, though, so I know some of you are familiar with the concept of a no promo homo state, but for those of you who are not, just very briefly, some states, including Alabama, have laws on the books that basically make it illegal to talk about LGBTQ issues, period, or make it illegal to talk about them except within the context of sexually transmitted infections. And so some of these participants were literally breaking the law. And if somehow or another someone had figured out that, like, you know, Bailey is this person, by virtue of them attesting to doing this work and it being a no pro homo state, I mean, they're legally liable. They're on the hook, not only in terms of their livelihood, but potentially for like legal action. And so there are ethical implications. And then there were personal needs and therapeutic needs as well. I am not a therapist, and I know this about myself. I actually struggle sometimes to even be like an empathetic human. And that's not like a comment on like me as a terrible person, but I struggle with like people see like, you know, this young woman, whatever person, and it's like, well, of course you have this maternal instinct and you'll have lots of children. And it's like, in fact, no, none of those things are true because like CNN and SWAT teams and like evening night coverage and all the things would just go badly. But sometimes they would come to these interviews and it would just be like an unloading mechanism for them. It's like, I've had this terrible day at school. My principal sucks. I almost got fired. I'm angry with my husband. I'm freaking pregnant and I'm hot and angry, you know, whatever. And so it would fulfill some of their personal needs. And so trying to figure out, like, what does that mean? Especially when these are people that you know well through multiple years, multiple interactions. And so, you know, where's the line and how do I find it and how do I negotiate and navigate that? There also were moments when they would have personal emergencies. You know, I can't be in the interview for the first 20 minutes because, you know, my grandmother's in ICU, and it's like, we shouldn't have the interview at all. No, but I need to talk to you. And so trying to figure out, like, the short version is that this longitudinal aspect to research has humanized research for me in ways that I don't think doing shorter term research would have so quickly. This morning when Camden came to help me navigate my way from the hotel because I have no sense of direction, I was sitting there and I had just learned that actually one of the participants from the residential study had passed away last night. And so several people over the course of the day that are involved in that study have been messaging me to make sure that I know. And so it's like there's a human element to research, and it's really easy to forget that sometimes. Or once you leave a site and you start writing up your data, it turns into headers, right? Like data analysis, theoretical conceptual framework, you know, whatever. And it's like, these are people. And then part of that too, in terms of them being people, is that I have observed and recorded illegalities that have happened. And so I said, like, one of the years of the residential study were excluded, and the reason for that was because one of the people involved, part of what I would do is they would have like this commons area, and they could always ask me, like, don't take notes, or like, you're not observing, and they would do that sometimes, like, you're not observing today, you know, you're out of researcher mode, and it's like, noted. You know, but other times they wouldn't, and there was one man in particular, and he would say things like, you know, I don't care if you get this, or yeah, you can go on and write this down. You want me to write it down for you? But he was basically sexually harassing some of the women, sometimes with women present and sometimes talking about them when they weren't there, but in really explicit ways. And so my data became evidence. And there were a number of, you know, legal actions that were taken on the part of the governing body that oversaw this program. And I ended up being a witness and having to give a deposition. And so, I mean, ultimately that year of data was just removed from the data corpus because I just don't want to have to try to figure out what are the ethical and legal implications of trying to use that for writing purposes. So it was just simply extracted and just turned over, basically. And I've had, in the novice teacher study, one of them had a drinking problem. She was an alcoholic. And so trying to figure out, like, how to basically not only counsel her out of the study, but also trying to figure out, like, how to help navigate, like, the implications professionally. And and it's a lot easier to not worry about those things if you know, like, I'm only going to collect this data for a year or a semester. It's a lot different when, like, you're in your 4th year of knowing this person and you realize, like, they have a really severe drinking problem. And so the ethical and legal implications become much messier and much more urgent by virtue of it being longitudinal. The last one is, in terms of my organization of thought, is this idea of, like, a greater appreciation of them and the work that they do and the work that they allow me to do, but also the ability for both them and me to be mutually critical of one another. And so in terms of the greater appreciation, Bailey being in a no pro homo state, her overcoming these near impossible situations, and and me just really being celebratory of the way that, like, she's killing it and being amazing and, like, rocking the world with really real risks. I mean, her principal basically threatening to not allow her to be certified because she was in a state that required 2 years of in-service practice before you could be certified to teach. And her principal just saying, like, you're too liberal and you're too progressive, and I'm not gonna sign off on your certification list. And her just deciding, like, you know what, I'm gonna do it anyway. And then also looking at, like, the ways that they've grown and they've improved and they've gotten really better at practitioners. Like, I shared some of the epistemic data at the workshop yesterday, but seeing some of them, like, really come into their own, like the first year or two, like, really struggling with, like, I don't know what to do, or what would you have done, or what do you think I should have done, or was that the right thing to do? And then several years later just being like, and that's what I told him because he's a son of a bitch and I do not care. And so just seeing that shift and sort of celebrating that with them and, like, seeing them get stronger as professionals. And taking greater degrees of calculated risk because they know the systems better. And then the appreciation of the time and the energy that participants give to us, whether it's filling out a survey or whether it's showing up for an interview. They give up time and energy that they don't owe us for any purposes. We need them, they do not need us typically. And okay, fine, they're getting like a $10 Starbucks gift card, woohoo! If that sometimes, but it's like the book club. Coordinating multiple schedules over multiple time zones and states is a nightmare, but they do it every month. And they do it willingly, and they're excited, and they check in. Like, if I have not reached out to try to figure out, like, here's the doodle poll, then they're just like, what's up? Are we not doing this? I read this book. I'm ready to talk. And then also just, like, seeing the ways that, like, they navigate with being professionals and really caring about their kids and really doing this work in really committed ways, but, like, life being in the way. Like, I'm pregnant and I miscarried and now, I'm trying to figure that out. Or, like, my grandparents really ill and I don't know what to do about that. Or, Lulu had to pick up and leave in the middle of the school year to go to Saudi Arabia for family purposes. And she's this very, like, tall, dramatic, loud, incredible human being. But it's like her in this setting as this really loud, dramatic, attention-grabbing woman heading into Saudi Arabia was in no way, shape, or form ideal for her, but it's something she needed to do. And then watching them overcome failure. Jacob, I have a paper coming out about Jacob next month, in fact. And Jacob sucked as a teacher when he started. I mean, he just sucked. And the kids told him so. And I think, frankly, if I had been him, I'd have just been like, Anne, I will do something else. But he's just like, nope, like, I was made to be a teacher, it is a calling, and I'm like, maybe you're being called to do something else. The kids are saying something different. But he's just like, nope. And so, like, he really, like, took, like, he would sit down and, like, have conversations with the kids about, like, what's sucking and how can I suck less. And by the end of, like, the second year, like, he was not just even adequate, he was pretty darn great. And so just really respecting a lot of the energy and the effort and time that they bring to the research and the ways that their stories really do matter, and their generosity in sharing them. But it also a readiness to be critical, both them of me and me of them. So one of the things that I said about the earlier one with the novice teachers is, so for example, like, if you're going to call yourself an ally, you gotta get off your ass and do stuff. Like, why don't you do this? And then the second year, I realized I was really protected last year. Like, if I really wanted to do something, I could come into the university and they'd support me, negotiate with my mentor, let me do what I want. Now it's just me. I'm suddenly accountable to a lot of people and worry about getting in trouble. And so at the third year and so on, there's this comment of, like, there are days I don't shut down a homophobic comment because I don't have the heart to watch the kid called fag be picked on later that day. Like, I know if I get onto kids for picking on him in my room, they're just going to go after him harder in the hallways. It's like me speaking up for the kid just confirms that he must be what others are calling him. And it's like, on the one hand, I understand what they're saying, and I can appreciate that. And I think that if this had been only like a year or a semester or even a one-time interview, I would have let it ride. I'd just been like, okay, like I get it. Your sociocultural and political context is very complex. But because these are people that I've known for multiple years, I feel able to sort of push back in the same way that they're able to be like, you didn't get this, you need to read this. You need to edit this, you need to rewrite it. It's like, you say you're doing ally work, but basically what you're saying is that being an ally is not doing the work. So what do you mean by that? Like, explore that more. And I don't think that I would be able to do that and it not be hurtful to them, except for the fact that we have multiple years of me supporting and celebrating them. And so them knowing, like, I'm not being critical in terms of fault finding, I'm being critical in terms of trying to understand. And so in year 4, this same person, she says, you asked about that. So she was talking about racism in her classroom. And then she says, you asked about that along with my ally work. So every time we talked last year, I always wondered, am I being an ally? Because I was asking her, I was pushing her, like, are you? I mean, I want to be, but am I? So since I knew we'd talk about this, because that's what we did, I've tried to pay more attention. I've started more actively bringing up things like gender norms when we read, and I try to push back against heteronormativity. So asking, why isn't it okay for this character to cry because he's a man? And the narrator doesn't say who the woman character is meeting for a date. Why assume it's a man? And so she starts to do this like self-critical work of reflecting and like, you know, am I doing ally work? Like I say I am, but then like when I think about it, like I really am not doing much of anything actually. And so what does that mean? But then the next part of it was because of this element of race and racism kept coming up. Like she would talk about the high number of students of color in her school, but then like it wasn't, the dots weren't connecting. Like, well, okay, well, fine. Like that's your demographic. Like how does that matter in terms of the work that you're doing? How does that matter in terms of you being an ally teacher? And again, I don't think those are questions I could have asked if this had just simply been a participant that I had for a one-time interview. But because we're in the 4th year at this point, it's like, well, okay, like you're doing all this like really useful cognitive work on like, am I an ally? How does race and racism relate to you being an ally? And she says, but now in thinking about how white my school is, because she had changed schools, and so this one was very affluent and very white. I'm starting to realize I never push them on genders and sexualities when it comes to race. Like, we talk about race, but it's separate. I could ask, this character is a Latino man. How do these facts shape us dismissing his masculinity when he cries? She was teaching a novel called Whirligig, which I had never heard of before she told me about it. But in the book, there is a man who, a woman rejects him, and he actually contemplates suicide. And so the kids are very dismissive of his masculinity. Well, he's not really a guy, whatever. And she's like, we explored that. We talked about like why is that masculinity? Like, why do we make that masculinity? But she's like, in fact, there are ethnic and cultural and racial components that I could have explored, and I just didn't. And so, you know, she says, why didn't I do that? But I don't know why. And this is not like to come to some really neat, tidy conclusion as much as it is to point out that like these are moments when what they're saying and what I'm trying to understand sometimes are in conflict or are incomplete. And so pushing one another. If I misunderstand, then they let me know. If they misunderstand or if what they're doing is something that seems to be sort of hedging around, then I feel able to sort of, you know, push back and be like, well, but why? Why do you do that? Why don't you do that? And because there's multiple years of relationship building, it's understood. This is just simply an effort to understand. And so these are some ways that like I've grown relative to longitudinal, but I will say that the things that I've pointed out are things that are true for all research. It doesn't matter how short or long it is. And so I would point out that like recognizing fluidity as an inevitable part of just being a human is a useful attribute for almost any researcher. It's one of the ways that we can potentially make sense of, sometimes participants will contradict themselves. I'm sure those of you who do survey research, it's infuriating for them to like, you know, bubble in one for strongly disagree and then the next item, which is almost identical, 5 strongly agree. And the same thing happens in qualitative research as well, where they'll say one thing and then they say something else and you're like, well, hold up. But in fact, sometimes it's not a matter of their lying, it's not a matter of their contradicting, it's a matter of based on the ways that you're contextualizing an item or a question, for them, it's simply it's a matter of a fluid shifting of self. And then this idea of like learning new theoretical and methodological concepts, I always think that it's super adorable and precious and wonderful that my students think that I know all things. And because I teach methodology classes, a lot of times it's just like, well, but like, what do you think? And I'm like, I have no idea. I do not know. And so it's been useful for me just to be able to like point to like very specific moments in my research and say to my students, like, this is a moment when I failed. This is a moment when I didn't know. This is a moment when my participants had to educate me or push me or question me. Because there are things that I want them to learn, but it's not just like, here, read this textbook that talks about how messy qualitative research can be. But instead it's like, these are examples. And these are times when I was a terrible researcher. And these are ways that I keep learning. The member checking, the ethical implications, we never know. Sometimes you can have a study that like IRB is like, oh, this is high risk. And in fact, nothing happens. And then you've got one and it's like, there are minimal risks. And then like the first time out of the gate, you're like, oh my God, now I have to like report all this stuff and I don't even know what's happening and why did you say this thing? Because we never know. But I will say that by virtue of doing the longitudinal stuff, like I'm better equipped, I think. But that's something that's true for any researcher, especially when you're involving people. People are messy and unpredictable. And so it's applicable to any and all research. The explorations of genders and sexualities, even when it's not brought up explicitly, there are often moments when this is a concept or a topic that's hovering in the background. It's the same with the race and the racism in my own research. Just because I'm not asking questions about it doesn't mean that it's not there. And so part of, I think, being an effective researcher, whether it's longitudinal research or otherwise, is being attentive to like where are the blank spaces, where are the silences, and trying to be prepared to search them, to probe them. And then thinking about intersectional identities. We all understand ourselves to be multiple complex people. Who you are in one space is going to be very gendered. Like if you're the only guy in a room full of women, you are very aware of being a man, as an example. But if you go to like a space where it's like a bunch of dudes, you're not necessarily thinking about like, I'm a guy. It's more of like, I'm the only white guy, or I'm the only large guy, or whatever. And so it's like who you are is often relative to where you are. And that's true for participants too. It's true in terms of who you are sitting across from them. It's true in terms of the questions that you're asking them relative to a survey or an interview. And so just being aware of like the ways that intersections of identities matter, both in terms of who they are, in terms of who you are, and in terms of who they understand you to be. And so these are things that like I've learned them by virtue of doing, these multiple years, but it's something that I think makes me a better teacher of research methods, and it certainly makes me a much better researcher. And I think it serves my students pretty well too. These are some recent publications that I have that have come from these studies that I've referenced. And they're all working to examine these various issues that I talked about. The one is looking at the way that Lillian's space mattered and that propriospect sociology theory coming into play. The second one is actually the one that Ryan was so helpful in giving me so much feedback at LRA. And it was about Lulu using this concept of alterity and like educating me on it. And so these are some examples of moments when I've learned from them, and it's resulted in scholarship. And they always decline to be co-authors, although I do have one that will be in English Journal where one of them is a co-author. But they typically decline because the risks are too big for them. And so that's part of my role as a researcher, is to try to make sure that I'm not speaking for them, I'm speaking with them, and so they at least have some role and some say in terms of what gets said. But that is all to come to a conclusion and ask you what questions you might have. And thanks. And I was also told by the very kind man that when you have a question, to push the little button, and it will light up a red light, and then the camera will orient to you.
Stephanie, thank you so much. I have fabulous talk. Really enjoyed many of the things you shared. I have a ton of questions, but I'll start with one and see what other people have to say. But one thing that I wanted to ask you is actually how you theorize member checking. And the reason why I'm asking you is because you emphasize through your talk the fluidity, the messiness, the unpredictability, yet often the notion of member checking is really built on the assumption of a fairly static human being, right? you produce this text and this interaction with me, and out of that interaction I made a transcript, and now I'm returning this transcript, or I'm coming back to you with the analysis and I'm checking with you whether I understood what you said correctly. But some people would say, and Charles Briggs has this fabulous book where he talks about how giving a person a transcript actually is a new speech act, right? It is already creating new understandings, right? So how do you think about that, and particularly with reconciling the fluidity you emphasize, but at the same time a fairly static notions that this idea is based on?
I love this question. I'm not sure that I'll be able to adequately answer it, but I shall try. So I think that when I first started, I had this very traditional notion of what member checking meant. You send them the transcript, they sign off on it, and now it's fair game for data analysis, right? It's really hard to hold on to that notion when you begin to see these as very complex and contradictory individuals. And so for me, member checking is actually, it's a very complex process sometimes because it has to mirror their complexity. So part of it is there's a lot of member checking in the interview itself, just to make sure that, like, I understand, I don't get it. There's always an element of the research where they're invited, strongly invited, and I will reach out to them, where they're invited in writing following an interview to work to clarify something, to schedule like a really quick follow-up if they want to, because sometimes things are more easily verbalized than they are written. But there's always some sort of follow-up component. They don't always take advantage of it, but there's always a follow-up invitation of, like, now that this has happened, is there anything that you're worried that I might have misunderstood, or something that you want to further develop? Do you want to clarify? Is there something I need to clarify, or whatever? And that's been useful sometimes. Sometimes they just don't. But then the other part of it is, okay, like, you send them this transcript. One of the things I will say is that it's been very useful for me to help them to better understand, like, what the function of a transcript is. And what the transcript is presumably supposed to do, and what I'm going to do with it. I think that's a big part of it, is like helping them to understand, like, what's going to be done with the transcript, because it's like, okay, you've got this thing and I'm asking you to, like, sign off on it, but if you don't know what I'm going to do with it, I don't know how you're supposed to do that. And so helping them to better understand, like, these are sections that I'm really looking at, that I'm paying attention to, like, this is sort of the way that I'm conceptualizing, organizing this data. Based on what you said earlier and then what you said this time, like, this is what's in my head. And so the transcriptions are typically, they're accompanied by at least an email body where it's just like, these are things that I'm thinking, these are things that I'm considering, what do you think about that? And so then when they're going through the transcript, there's a frame of reference, there's like a purpose that they're mindful of. Because again, like, as publications start to come out, like, it becomes real, like, someone's writing about me, someone's talking about me. And so that's a part of it too. But the longitudinal research, one of the reasons that I love it is because since they do have fluid identities and transcript is often this fixed text point, it gives multiple opportunities for them to say, all right, I said this last time, but thinking about it, like, I realized, like, I wasn't clear. Or me saying to them, like, you said this last time and I really thought about it. Now, like, I need for you to, like, help me better understand. Because there have been moments when, frankly, they've said things that could be completely, like, I could pull that out of the data. I could extract that and write a great article about how racist they are. I mean, it would be super easy. There's plenty of data there to support that. But that's not actually what's happening. It's just really easy to cherry pick and decontextualize. And so I'm afforded the opportunity to go back to them and say, like, you said this. For someone who doesn't know you, like, how do you think that might be received? Like, what would you want them and me to better understand based on this statement that you made? And so for me, it's not just like this iterative process, because that's always something people throw around in qualitative research, right? It is definitely a mutual process, and it should be mutually beneficial, even if they're not getting, like, publication credit per se. They get to have a say and they get to have a stake in terms of what's happening with their words. Because I do conversation analysis, the audio is often an expected part of the data set. Like, you submit your audio along with your article. I don't ever do that without their permission. And some of them are genuinely concerned about, like, I have this real thick Southern drawl and people are going, no, that's me. And it's like, probably not, but, I'm going to respect you. And so helping them to, I think the other part of that is helping them to understand what informed consent means. and that they're always able to renegotiate those terms and to disengage if they need to or want to. And so I don't know if that's like a winding response to your question. I don't think that I have the answer for how to do like great member checks, but I do think that they have helped me to better appreciate ways that they should be involved in that process, the ways that what I am doing and saying with their words matter to them too, and that it's not just like my data. They produce that data. It's co-produced, and so it therefore should be co-understood and co-managed. You don't have to explain it all. Teach real good. Be safe. Thank you for coming. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I have a question.
You have a button.
Yeah, don't forget the button. I'm red now. I loved your talk, and this is really interesting stuff because it's partly new in that I haven't seen it from the research perspective. I do have a question, but I'd like to kind of backtrack on just a little background so you understand where I come from too. But I'm a trained sign language interpreter. I went to a deaf university for my first graduate degree, and I was always the only male in most of my classes. It's just the way it was. And if you look at sort of our professional statistics, about 90% of professional certified interpreters are females.
And you moved to a college of education where
right.
that demographic shifted dramatically.
Well, we end up going a lot into the schools too, right? So it's interesting to me then that the leftover bits of the 10% or so who were male typically did not identify as straight. And I thought, okay, this is just what this is. But then when I got into the university and really started immersing myself in the culture, I realized that this was a prominent concept, this LGBTQ plus situation. Right. And granted, now I graduated 2008, so in the last 10 years things have evolved as far as the conversation's concerned. But I guess what I'm getting at, and my question to you is, do you find or have you seen through some of the research that some of these more sort of minority type groups tend to pull or bring in that kind of person or someone who's more open to that kind of identity? Because it just seems like to me throughout my experiences, and again this is anecdotal,
that's still data.
True, but it seems like a lot of the culture and then also the people who kind of found themselves attracted to the culture may have already kind of come from that identity set. So do you find that to be the case throughout sort of like the minority groups or any sort of handicapped groups or anything like that?
I think it's an interesting question. I haven't given it a whole lot of thought in the ways that you've phrased it. I will say feminist standpoint theory speaks to this concept to some degree. There's an argument that like Patricia Hill Collins especially makes that in effect, being an oppressed person makes you more aware of and therefore interested in the welfare of other oppressed people. So there is some work in terms of feminist theorists relative to this question that you're asking. I do think that if some of you have seen like Mean Girls, or like if you're just familiar with like high school social groups and cliques and so on and so forth, I do think there is some degree of truth just in terms of social interaction that we understand who we are relative to larger peer groups. And sometimes, especially if your peer group is not represented based on the space where you are. So like if you're the only man, for example, you might try to affiliate yourself more readily with another group that seems to be minoritized in that space. And again, this is anecdotal for me as well because this is not exactly my research, but I will say that like in my classes, especially women of color, sometimes there will be one or two, but they will sometimes affiliate themselves with other people who seem to also not belong to the dominant demographic, whatever it is. And so, I mean, I think part of that is, and this is sociology and anthropology, which is not my bag, I'm still learning. But I think part of it is in trying to navigate sociocultural spaces. We become very attuned to who the dominant people are. We're very aware of hierarchy and the way that it helps or hinders us. And so I will also add relative to Meyer's findings about like novice teachers being more inclined to do ally work, that it may be that there are a lot of heterosexual men who enter into it and they get there and they're accustomed to being the dominant population, and then they're not, and so they potentially don't stay. It could also be, there's a lot of research on the feminization of education. A lot of men don't enter into education because it's considered a feminized profession in the same way that like dental hygienists are, for example. And so that could potentially be a part of it too. I don't know a whole lot about like sign language interpretation as a career, but it may be that it has this reputation or understanding of having been feminized, in which case it's not surprising that the men who are there are a minority, and the men who are there tend to be, in some way, shape, or form, not aligned with like the dominant norms of masculinity. That's my big ol' I don't know answer.
I actually wanted to just follow up because I think the question may have come out wrong. It was more or less about me and more so about the culture and sort of why then these groups of people tend to gravitate towards it. And I think you may have hit it without really noting it, and this made sense to me that if you're oppressed, if you're used to dealing with being the minority, if you have a disability that you've been picked on for the rest of your life, it seems like that is one and the same as some of the oppression that these other groups are dealing with too. So maybe that's the commonality, and I think you just hit it on the head, honestly.
Possibly, and it could also be that a lot of service industry careers tend to be navigated by people who are often more oppressed societally, because you're more attuned to the need of helping others, you're more attuned to the importance. And so, I mean, that could be a part of it too, but I mean, again, that's not research that's been done on this particular set. But at any rate, yeah, feminist standpoint theory has lots to say on that topic though. Yes, please do. My students can attest, I'm quite good at responding to email. It does not go into an abyss of nothingness, I promise. Yeah. Yeah. I'm here in the state, right? 2.5 hours away. So yeah. Thank you so much for coming. Roll Tide. I know that's what you meant. Roll Tide. I don't know how to stop it.